Yeah, so thank you for coming. We're gonna start. We have this amazing lineup of panelists today to talk about the housing barriers in Vermont and what are we gonna do about it? What are the challenges that we can work together to solve and to move forward. So my name is Amanda Garces. I am the Director of Policy, Education and Outreach for the Vermont Human Rights Commission. I have a great team here today. We have India, if you want to say hi, Sarina, John, that can help us with chats, with questions, any technological issues that we're having. We are here to support. And I'm going to turn it over to my friend Asma Elhuni, who's going to give us a long acknowledgement to begin this wonderful panel.
Cool. Can everyone hear me? Awesome. Great. We are located on the land which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among Indigenous peoples for thousands of years and is the home of the Abenaki people. We honor, recognize, and respect these peoples, especially the Abenaki, as the traditional stewards of the land and waters on which we gather today. In that spirit, today we will begin by acknowledging that we are guests in this land. We need to respect and help protect the lands within our use.
Thank you. Thank you. So we're going to start today grounding us in the real stories of the people. And I'm going to start with Pamela Williams as our first speaker. And yeah, so here you are, Pamela.
Yes. Good afternoon. Wonderful to be with you. One of the interesting things about what I'm going to say to you is, both as a community member who has known Vermont, as somebody who has worked in seasonal fields in both education and human services, and has tried to increasingly establish longer residencies to be able to work and be more part of the community, which has brought on the impact of housing challenges. And my background, both as an educator in the K-12 range, work with diversity and equity, and work with independent schools and the bridging of public schools, as well as work with higher education impacts this, as well as knowing what are the direct needs for wellness and growth for people across the ages of growth. What I would say about this is the accumulation of wealth and how we hold that really still is a major force to be looked at. And as we know, especially with COVID, brings up some other challenges, because some people have access to networks, either through their own families, informally, or through financial resources where they do not have to be on the open market. And we need the government to work with community reinvestment of economic resources so that affordability, low to moderate ranges of housing are available and safe, so that people can thrive, as well as not be stigmatized by times where there have been challenges that do not show the best of their abilities, but they participate in growth and have a desire to work and be productive to the community. And this is something that the community benefits from, to see the resilience of people who have worked hard, whether they are new Americans, Americans new to the area, whether they are young people, whether they are older people with experience and changes in lifestyle changes. They contribute to the community, and need the access to the housing in ways that doesn't diminish what they have achieved and gives them the most opportunities for the future. We see that that is still greatly a challenge. And I can say that as somebody who is a person of color, who grew up in Chicago, has lived on the East Coast in major cities as well as some semi-rural areas. And I see that it is still very important to have education about the resources that people can use, and also for the providers and those particularly in charge of funding and dispersing government funds, so that people are not stuck in categories that limit their mobility. I would also highly say that the other formation of community, such as faith-based initiatives, joint urban ministries, the ability to know cultures and community, these sources need to be sustained, particularly at this time where, again, exposure to the resilience that various cultures have brought can enhance the ability to use these resources and have greater understanding and leadership that is informed. It also is very important because when we look at stress factors, how we then enact power, but also how we feel good and competent about actions that we have done and are not having to do apologizing. Although there is responsibility in looking at the need for things such as reparations, if it comes from a more full understanding of the history and known information that may have been hidden from us to know the full effect of causes and the operation of systems. This is still a great resource that we have, particularly in Vermont, and our land, the availability of educational organizations, a mix of people who can provide these viewpoints. It does require, in my view though, a great call of public-private partners to work together to broker, again, the availability and resourcing for affordability. And thank you for the opportunity here. And this leads a direction to become knowledgeable with new partners that I hope will definitely be enhanced as we have transfer of power at the national level, look at where that places us in the global world, and to our close community and neighbors.
Thank you, Pamela. Thank you so much. And yes, and we hope that collectively we can, you know, do those barriers and like figure out like the map of how all of that goes together. So why don't I go next with Asma? Are you ready? And you know,
Yeah, sure.
dear friend, and also just a really strong activist here in Vermont and New Hampshire. And I just want to say how honored I am to have you here today, and all the work that you do. You're always thinking about other people and always thinking how we're gonna move this work. So
thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. I feel honored, and to be honest, like with all these experts, I'm not an expert. I'm just an organizer on the ground, and I appreciate the creation of that space for people like on the ground talking to people. So thank you so much for like including me when I don't have the wonderful expertise these other people do. I am an organizer with Rise Upper Valley, and I organize mostly in the Upper Valley. and I'm a part of a mutual aid team that was started in the Upper Valley, and we coordinate volunteers, again, in the Upper Valley, and we try to assist where we can. The Upper Valley is an interesting location that really is like a combination of both Vermont and New Hampshire, so solutions always have to like mean working across states. And in Vermont and New Hampshire, we know that the low income tax credit that the federal government gives, the states, both Vermont and New Hampshire, get a low state minimum. So basically that money from the federal government to states for affordable housing isn't really enough, right? And basically, if you want to know how much, it's kind of like enough for only 4 to 7 small projects in both states, basically. They're usually small projects which create only like 30 units in each state. So that should kind of like give us, so clearly we need more federal funding, so we can push for that from our federal congregation delegates. But also states can also invest and prioritize where to put their money. So for example, we can support, defunding police efforts, for example, that is happening all across the country, and allocate money towards affordable housing, right? In the Upper Valley, there's a huge housing issue. And I hope one of the things I bring to this conversation is that being unhoused or having houselessness, right, is an affordable housing problem, and that some of these things people are facing can be fixed and changed. So at the moment, many of the unhoused community in the Upper Valley are in hotels, not all of them, but a lot. There's about 130 families moved into hotels and motels. And keeping in mind location of shelter really matters. There's one shelter, for example, in the Upper Valley where there is no bus line, right? And so how will these people get to work, get to services they need, like finding housing, for example, or health, or whatever else they need to do. Also, people in these motels, some of the motels that we've been like delivering meals to, etc., made it very clear that they are not allowing refrigerators in the hotels and motels, and because of electrical systems or whatever. And so let's think about like, even though we had a period of time we were delivering food, and now someone else is taking that. So yeah, food is delivered, but let's also think about how are they keeping their food, that the extra leftovers now, right? Or how are they keeping their milk cold, right, with no refrigerator? So these communities have figured out ways to be creative and create community care even amongst each other. Like I know some folks that we've talked to, they literally have taken on the role of driving people within the motel to the locations that they need to get to, like work, etc. But people really deserve the possibility of more stable solutions, right? And this temporary solution is important, but putting people in hotels is still a band-aid kind of solution that is needed, but we have to look beyond that and to invest basically in longer term stable solutions, because these are expensive solutions. Again, we need them, I know, but still not getting us to where people need to be in the long run, right? Longer term solutions and stability. Like maybe, for example, purchasing a hotel and converting it into permanent housing for people, for the unhoused community, for example. In the Upper Valley, there was a study done by Lake Sunapee Planning Commission years back, and found that the Upper Valley was short 4,000 to 5,000 housing units to meet the community need. So, and that is including like all these different levels. It's not just low income, but obviously lower end of the income spectrum are most impacted. There are people on waiting lists for 7 years in the Upper Valley, right? And oftentimes you have to like reapply every year just to stay on this waiting list, right? Some people told me they just stopped reapplying, because it's hard to like reapply every single year, because they're just giving up, because year after year they're not getting in. And so it's kind of like, this is never happening if you're on it like for many, many years. There are people that told me this year, so this isn't in the Upper Valley, this is somebody in Burlington that said they're on a list, but they don't want to reapply because the application is basically asking for the landlord that they're currently in's name, and they have a bad relationship because they're organizing around this horrible landlord, and therefore why you know, why do we have to give him his name and then not get in? So it's like, I'm not even going to reapply this year. So these are just some of the things that have come up. And also in the Upper Valley, there's a lack of services that get people to housing. Like there was somebody, for example, who was unhoused, didn't have a social security card. All she needed was a social security card for ID, right? There was no ID for her. And so we had to get a community member to apply. Like you would think there's a group, or oftentimes you think the Haven, but clearly they didn't serve this need for her. And there's a second person who now also needs a social security card. So just thinking, how do we get people the basic stuff to get them into housing? And also one of the things I also think is important to mention is like, how do we feel our own biases around affordable housing? And so let's ask, you know, how comfortable are we if they built up, you know, affordable housing next to our homes, right? Because in for example, I think it was Woodstock, you know, the community got together and fought tooth and nail to make sure affordable housing wasn't built, because you know, the stigma of having, but these people are the people, your community members, you know, people who do our groceries, they're healthcare workers, they serve our food. So just thinking about that as well. Something else I also want to mention when we're talking about affordable housing, I find it interesting that oftentimes what we don't look at is something called the average median income. And when they're building affordable housing, oftentimes it's like on the 60% of the average median income, the AMI, and that's like on the higher end, close to median income of the town. We should go lower. Like we should have a set to say like 30% of the AMI goes, which means people making the least amount in our society get a certain amount of housing, and then we could do 60%. So that that's just something we should like, because I don't think that's mentioned a lot. Like affordable housing, we're not reaching those on the very, very lower end. So we have to be intentional about that. And the other thing is like zoning, like locally, we can change zoning laws, because especially like particularly in the Upper Valley, there's really strict zoning laws, right? So maybe we change the zoning laws so that buildings can be higher, so that we can, you know, include more people, increasing density, right? And so just different things that we can do locally to help with housing as well. So yeah, and I just want to remind people that housing is a human right. Everyone deserves to be safe. Everyone deserves to have access to shelter. Everyone deserves to have access to healthy food, clean air, water, education. And all these things are deeply connected, and we have to understand like this right extends to everyone regardless of, you know, race, religion, economic status, disability, your sexual orientation or gender, and that these things all these things that I just mentioned do affect these populations at a much higher rate. And also like when people are making livable wages, this also affects housing. So like all these things are connected, right? Housing affects people's health, right, etc. And this issue affects us all. So even if we think, oh, I'm doing okay, I have a place to stay, no, this also affects you. It's in our best interest that everyone have safe, affordable housing. And when people are thriving, we all thrive. When people are safe, we all are safe. And you can look at what's happening with COVID. If people don't have safe, good housing, we have the spread of COVID, right? When people don't have fair housing, we get people who will be desperate to do things that they would otherwise not do. When people don't have safe housing, this affects, you know, our jobs, and it affects, you know, the children in schools. So yeah, this issue affects everyone. And thank you again for giving me the time to share.
Thank you. And we need organizers. We need lots of organizers around the state. Organizers make things happen. So thank you for all your work and for your wisdom. I think I'm gonna turn it over to Sarah, if that's okay. Sorry, I'm like popcorn. I'm like, I'm just gonna, maybe I should give you a heads up before, but Sarah is amazing, the executive director of the Vermont Center for Independent Living and a fierce advocate for disability rights. So here you are.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Thank goodness. Okay, well, thank you so much for this invitation to participate today. I've been thinking since Amanda had sent some questions about housing justice and experiences that I've had over the years. Like she said, I'm the executive director of the Vermont Center for Independent Living. VCIL is a statewide organization, and we work to support individuals with disabilities. We're sometimes mistaken as a housing site because our name has independent living in it. And the history of that is a bit interesting, especially in relation to our conversation today, because those of us who are in the independent living movement saw the name taken by housing developers who then used it to their benefit. Independent living is a philosophy. It was developed by Ed Roberts in the 1950s. And it comes from the principle that folks with disabilities are entitled to the same civil rights and control and choice over our own lives. And from this model, Roberts received a MacArthur Foundation recognition, and now there are independent living centers carrying out this mission all over the world. The history is important because most people think of independent living as a concept developed in housing. It isn't. And yet, some will feel defensive when I say this or even debate me because everything they've learned, everything that was taught before them was based in that knowledge. And they never questioned it. And that's harmful. The words independent living should always have Ed Roberts or others of the independent living movement attached. The housing developers stole that concept from a man who has polio, lived in an iron lung, and developed these thoughts from experiences he personally had, and which is the foundation of the independent living movement today. But we know this story, right? There are many marginalized people left out or cut out of history. And there are stories preserved to fill a vision of hope or one that can fund the next project. Housing rights can only be realized when we open our eyes to justice and the whole entire story, absorb and use our positions to change that system. I started working in disability rights in 1997. I had my experiences as a woman with a psychiatric disability who had spent years in and out of psych hospital settings, put in a group home with people who have other mental health and substance use issues, and then into my own apartment living on disability benefits and subsidized housing. I landed in Barrie in an apartment building that until I moved in there were only for widows of veterans. And then here I was in my 20s with a non-apparent disability. There was lots of gossip. Those experiences, though, shaped me as a human and as an advocate. And when I think about the barriers in housing, I could go through the whole list. The stigma attached to disability, there is not enough housing, there are financial barriers, physical access barriers, Section 8's a mess, eligibility barriers. But again, none of those will be solved until we really all agree that the barriers to housing are based in the roots of racism, xenophobia, ableism, homophobia, and others. Housing is not just a housing issue. We all know that. I'll articulate an example that happened recently. The personal assistant to a person with a disability recently died, and the person needs assistance for daily living. Our systems of personal attendants are overburdened, underpaid, and hard to find in a pinch, and we're living through a pandemic, which makes it all just a bit harder. This person is now desperate to find someone or they will end up in a nursing home, and they do not want to be put in a nursing home. Now pause for a moment because some people are maybe thinking problem solved, we have nursing homes. That person has a place to live and will be cared for. That's ableist. This person does not want to live that way. It's his choice and should not be the choice of an oppressive system where the only way out is to put someone where they don't want to be. And this is the type of system we try to change all the time, but the rules are against us. And what's worse are the excuses that are now the answers we get from lawmakers, from policymakers who say they're on our side. What's worse is that people just all believe it and don't take the time to try something new, to invest in something new, or frankly, something old that just needs to be invested in. If we are talking about housing justice, we need to talk about the systems that surround housing, and we need to challenge the systems that are set up to ensure that they're not ableist and taking the rights away of folks with disabilities. And then there's the planning process. How many times have you gone through a planning process? You were asked by policymakers as someone representing a marginalized group what your ideas are. You offer up all your suggestions, and then they write them up in a neatly formatted report so that they can say they completed the mandated process, and then say, well, we make the decision and we simply can't make this change because there's not enough money. That uses marginalized communities. And if you don't get to go to those planning meetings, then you're not represented, and the cycle continues. I am not trying to attack people who are engulfed in this work. I've been engulfed in this work. I'm trying to say that while sometimes things change, a lot needs to be different, and we can learn from those experiences. In some circumstances, we don't even know what we don't know, but we need to be able to set aside our ego and learn and figure out different ways and approaches that we can have. I had that experience years ago when I served on the Vermont Access Board. The board was made up of mostly professionals, mostly men, and at the time, all white people. There were a few people with differing types of disabilities. A woman came to us for a variance on a ramp. She did not have a disability and explained to us that she had been shown one townhouse by a developer, and then after making the purchase, found out there was a ramp and that she couldn't remove it because of Vermont law. So my job is to make sure we keep ramps on buildings. So I didn't back down as an Access Board member and advocate. But what I failed to do in that moment on that board was to hear and listen to her. Her story was like other Black and brown folks who were told one thing and then sold something different. And then to find out their only legal solution was to go in front of a panel of white people who didn't even understand the nuances of systemic racism to know that they were playing a part in it. That's the system set up to allow for all of it to play out. I, being a staunch advocate that every home needs a ramp, became defensive when she described this because she was Black. It took me years to understand what part I played in this. Years to understand the racism I brought to the table as a white woman with a position of power. Years to understand that our systems are set up to weaponize and pit us against each other. These systems where we sit in judgment of others have got to stop. This person can have housing if they just, fill in the blank, stop using drugs, get rid of their criminal record, come up with a bunch of money up front, act differently. All code for we don't want you. And as advocates, we need to continue to shake up those systems because many of us who think we're doing a good job are just perpetuating the same system over and over. There's so much good work being done in this state, and I want to see our communities flourish. And I'm ready to start picking apart what doesn't work and strive for what does. And I absolutely, Amanda, appreciate the opportunity to share from my experience today. Thank you.
As always, thank you for your wise words and for all the work that you're doing. And yes, you're very inspired us all with all of this to continue our work. So, and yeah, remember this is about collective liberation and how we move together in all of these things that are happening. And you hit it on the nail in many of the things. So I'm gonna now bring Skylar Wolfe, who is a great LGBTQ plus advocate, and here you are. Are you here, Skylar?
Thank you. Yes, I am.
Yes, thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you so much.
Of course. Is it okay if I share my screen? Do I have that option? I have to give it a try. 1 second. Gotta love technology. Okay. All right, I think it's gonna work. Yay. So I wasn't sure exactly what format this panel was going to take, and I put together a couple slides, but I've also felt really just, I guess, in touch and like motivated and kind of feel myself changing course a bit after listening to other people speak. Like Pamela, you were talking about wealth access, which is so important, and Sarah, like what you just shared is just so critical and like speaking from the heart about personal experiences and the ways that this is actually showing up for people. So I might go off script a little bit here. But I wanted to focus today on something that comes up for me a lot, which is actually comfort, which isn't the first thing that people think of when they think of housing typically, but I see it as being like this foundational piece of discrimination in more subtle ways, or the ways that bias plays out. And we see that in employment, which is obviously you need to have access to employment in order to have income to have housing, right? But we also see it with roommates, we see it with landlords, and we also see it with family. So Pamela, with what you were saying about access to wealth, like for LGBTQ plus people, it's really common to be cut off from your family entirely and to not have access to inheritance, or like if you're homeless, like you might not be able to go to your family to stay the night there because it might not be safe for you, or they literally might not let you in. And yeah, so comfort is really foundational. I first came across that word a few years ago when I was like at this meeting with somebody who was supposed to be teaching me about how to get a job. And they were like, whatever you do when you're meeting with an employer, never make them uncomfortable. And the thing is, if when you have privilege and like when you have internalized bias that you might not be aware of, you become uncomfortable just by being around people with experiences and identities different than your own. So that means lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer people. That means people of color. If you're white and you're not used to being around people of color.
Sorry, Skylar, I'm sorry. Are you sharing the screen? Because we cannot see the screen and your volume just went low a little bit.
Thank you. Yes, I am sharing the screen.
Okay, because we cannot see. It just says he has started screen sharing and is blank.
Okay.
There we go.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, sorry.
And Skylar, you'll see in the chat, everyone says your volume is too low. So I think you need to be closer to your mic.
Thank you. New microphone. Is that better?
That's much better. Thank you.
Sorry about that. Thank you for letting me know. Yeah. So there's a lot that plays into this, but comfort ends up being like this strand that like ties together these housing barriers that LGBTQ plus people, and particularly when we think about having multiple marginalized identities, like for queer and trans people of color, queer and trans people of color with disabilities, etc. It uniquely impacts whether or not an employment environment or a housing situation is going to be safe or accessible to you. Like I have tremors, and they seem subtle. They seem like they wouldn't impact my work too much, but they do. And it means that I have unique needs in employment in order to feel safe. Anyways, I'm gonna keep going, just being aware of time. So what can we do? You know, Asma, when you were talking, like you introduced yourself by saying, you know, I'm just an organizer. And if working at a nonprofit for the last 2.5 years has taught me anything, it's that we need organizers. We need people in the streets, on the ground, like doing work, because nonprofits and certainly private sectors and the government, they can't do it themselves. Like there's just not enough. The system's broken in so many ways. So it takes being proactive. It takes like holding yourself accountable and like also practicing self-care along the way, and holding others accountable. But to me personally, it feels important to do that in whatever ways we're able, and to make room for growth whenever possible, although sometimes that it doesn't feel possible, which certainly is the case right now. I know that's coming up for me a lot. Yeah, but being involved and supporting opportunities for structural change. So like obvious housing barrier issues like livable wages and just in general, like having affordable housing, legal protections, etc. But the last thing that I'll highlight just as a final note is I used to work for Pride Center Vermont. I was the director of the Safe Space Anti-Violence Program up until very recently. And a trend that really was troubling for me was similar to what Sarah was pointing out, which was that we have all of these services that make us believe that if somebody's homeless, they're gonna have housing, or like if somebody's hungry, they're gonna have food. And that's, or like if somebody experiences discrimination, like we have these legal protections, so they'll be taken care of. And that's just not true. Like there are many people in Vermont right now who are homeless because of discrimination, whether that's because of race or disability or sexuality and gender or all of the above. And the solution, I'm not that hopeful that the solution is in nonprofits anymore, or like the assumed service providers. Like, we have to work together. And what a difference it would make if somebody who has an extra room in their house was willing to let somebody stay there. Yeah. And I think I'll end on that note, just getting involved in ways that we can, and knowing what we have access to that other people might not have access to, and doing our best to share that.
Thank you, Skylar. That's really powerful. It makes me think a lot about all the mutual aid groups that came out of COVID, how it was just natural and organic, and the work that Asma shared, but Burlington also had a really strong group, Montpelier, and there's just like all these little pockets around the state that were like, here we are for each other. And I think this is the time where how do we translate that to our day-to-day struggles of the people? Like, we have all these issues before COVID. We had them before. This is new. This just kind of like showed a little bit of humanity of people that somehow was hidden. And so that it exists. It does exist. So I appreciate that. So I'm gonna turn it over to Steffen, who is another organizer. He's the president of the Windham County NAACP, and yeah, always speaking truth to power.
Thank you. So I'll just jump right into it, since you gave that, I like things to be brief, so you gave that great brief introduction. So yeah, you sent us a couple questions. I understand that we probably can't get to all of the questions, and I guess this is not really the forum to do that, but I will say that I think we need to start off by saying that Vermont has an attitude problem, right? We talk about things in this very granular level, but we rarely ever acknowledge that the state as a whole has a collective attitude problem when it comes to Black and brown people and pretty much anybody else, right? So what does that mean? It means that racism is not only alive here covertly, but it's also, it's manifesting, and it's manifesting purposefully between circles of white people mainly, who are discussing with each other behind closed doors how they can and should look good in front of people of color, while also holding onto their power structurally and institutionally through policy and really nice talk. And I think that a lot of times there is an assumption that folks of color do not understand nor see what that is. But I would say that when you have populations who have gone through years of colonialism and oppression, it's almost like a spider sense. And so you're really just fooling yourself, and we just roll our eyes and bide our time, right? So I think that that is kind of one way to frame it, at least the way that I see it. When we talk about barriers to housing access, first thing we have to do is fix our actual attitude problem, right? We have to understand that housing is not affordable here, that there are people who move to the South all the time that are folks of color who go on to get farms and housing. I know plenty of them who could not get housing or land here in Vermont. Now, what does that mean? That means that we have these policies that look pretty on paper, and like I said, make everybody feel good, but when you go to use them and put practice in from theory, there is no action. There is no way to actually see fruits of that, of our, so-called labor, right? That is the resentment that I see coming out of communities of color towards a lot of our whitely owned resources and structures around land and home ownership. There is also a lot of microaggressive behavior that is not talked about for people of color that they have to endure. So it's like, you have to think about it. Would you want to own a home? Would you want to own land here? Even if you love the land and you're connected to it, which a lot of our ancestors are because we had to farm it for so long. Do you want to deal with your racist white neighbors and the whole NIMBY attitude? We've seen what happened in Rutland. We've seen what happened in Bennington. those are things that we also have to contend with and have real conversations around. There is also no equitable and affordable pathways to entry pretty much at all. And all of the ones that are talk about this, you know, beautiful idea of land sharing, which is great on its face, but it also doesn't honor the ancestry of a lot of folks, right? So if you're the descendants of slaves, what does land sharing have to do with you? How is that different than sharecropping? How are you going to differentiate that, right? It doesn't sound great on paper. And if we're trying to bring people from other states our way, then how are we going to do that and message that in a way that's actually marketable and says what we're trying to do, and also leads to some sort of ownership, right? There are other cultures and other folks who believe in shared land. How do we have pathways to do both? And I think that's something that Vermont should be working on. We also don't talk about the intersection of policing much in this conversation, but it is very real and true. And the fact that in Vermont, there is a real hypervigilance of police. And a lot of people, including here in Southern Vermont, get pulled over at, I think, 5, 6, or 7 times more than their white counterparts. I mean, going from Black to Hispanic on down. So when we talk about removing barriers, we really are talking and having a conversation with white people and challenging them to challenge themselves to actually act today, right after this panel is over, to reach out to people of color, to reach out to queer folks, and see what you can do in your spheres of influence to actually remove those barriers. I don't really care to hear a lot of discussion around what it means to be white in these spaces. I want to see more about, what it means to be white and actionable in these spaces. That we are talking about a race issue. And the fact that we have structures that have been created for colonial control in Vermont. Point example would be a select board. A select board is created, or most of them were created, for white male land ownership. If you're asking folks of color to come into your town to own land, and they can't even advocate for themselves because the select board is a tool for white supremacy, then how are they going to do that successfully? What is your policy and the state level going to do at the town level in that regard, right? So those are all things that we should be thinking about, in my opinion. We also need to be talking about how we could support and build out the infrastructures that are already happening. We do have a lot of Black and brown people and their allies who are pushing these structures on the ground, and they've done it through a lot of fundraising, actually, or direct advocacy with lawmakers who would listen. We need to see how are we going to support that? How can we move into that realm and build capacity that way? Because as we've already seen, a lot of our white-led organizations have failed us time and time again. Also, how do we center and uplift the voices of queer people of color? At the end of the day, queer people of color are the ones who are leading these movements. The femmes and the women are leading these movements, but not only are they leading these movements, they're the ones who have a fundamental understanding of what safety actually means and how it's implemented when it comes to land. That is not to discount queer folks who are not of color, because they also do have a very similar understanding, but that intersection is pivotal. When you're not only queer, so you're isolated from the hetero cis community who slams you with all sorts of biases, but you're also visibly a person of color trying to live in a white area. So with that being said, I think I want to just leave everyone with a couple of questions, and just in case we don't have much more time left. And those are like, what will you do today? What POC queer folks, and I wrote these down because I always forget them, but what POC queer folks in your area will you work with today, and how will you support them in your own spheres of influence and push? And the solution that you have, that you have, and that's best built with, how do I say this? I always mess this question up. Anyway, it doesn't matter. The solution is you, pretty much. The solution is you. You're the barrier and the solution, and you have to get out of our way and get behind us and push us forward. And Amanda, I don't know if I'm over my 7 minutes, but I'm all done.
That was amazing, and I want you guys to write those questions down, because then we're gonna finish the loop, and then we'll come back to the questions that Steffen is posing for all of us of what we're gonna do. So I'm gonna move it to Sefakor, who is an amazing advocate and leader. Getting her PhD, or did you already get your PhD? And then she also works for the Vermont Center for Independent Living. So here's your time. And thank you, Steffen. That was great.
Thank you, Amanda. I'm a doctor now.
Now you're a doctor now. Yay! Doctor.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to be on this platform. I must say I'm so grateful to see a lot of faces, especially those who helped me to be here today. When I say help me, I mean help me through the transitioning of getting a housing or to be in a room one day. And thank you for those deep words. The four presenters have actually taken words out of my mouth, and especially my director. I don't know how you feel when you have your director with you on the same platform talking about pressing issues affecting you on the grassroots level, and that was Sarah. And I am so much humbled. Steffen, I am so much impressed because you just nailed it. Before I start, my son actually asked me this question, which I will add to your questions. My son, when I told him and I showed it on Facebook, I'm going to talk on this, he was like, are you sure you want to talk about this? This is our story. And are you sure you will change anything after this and we will leave this house or this apartment? Because after this, I want to leave this apartment. Anyway, so the question is, are we sure we are going to make the change after this platform? Yes, as a transformational leader, I came to Vermont about 8 years now, and through the school system. I started from Brattleboro when I did my master's program at SIT, and I came in again for my PhD. Interestingly, I don't know how many of you have traveled out and know how you can be stranded along the line, knowing nowhere, especially if you are going to school. You know you are going to school system and there will be everything accessible for you. So when I heard everybody who talked, you talked about affordability, and I will add accessibility to it, because all the buildings that we have are not affordable and are not accessible. So my story goes like this. Here I lost my daughter before coming. In 3 months. I lost the sister of my son, my twin daughter. And in 3 months, I have to start my PhD. And I was communicating very much vibrantly with my director, my supervisor, or the leadership of UVM. Everybody knew about my loss, and everybody knew about my coming. Everybody knew that this is a woman with disability and a woman of color from nowhere coming to this school. And as I arrived, I spent some time in New York, and I knew that everything was perfect for me in Burlington. And I was communicating with people who are on my link or my network. A personal mother that I have is Deborah Lisi Baker, who is also on this platform, has played a very big role. She started looking for housing for so many months alongside with people that we know, but we never found any accessible housing. And we hope that we will get to the school system and the school will do something about it. Here I was at UVM, and everything was not accessible. So I have this identity. I'm a woman. I have family, and with my disability. So these three identities actually excluded me to stay on campus because because I have family. I can't stay with my family on campus, and also the buildings are not accessible. And the worst thing that happened to me was, if I should leave outside campus at all, there was no place, because the houses which are affordable are actually not inclusive enough. Why? Because I have this status as international student identity also. So even though some of the housing are accessible, like I can have access after filling the form about 2-3 months time, then they will send me the message that we are sorry, we cannot give it to you because you are not part of us. And that is the systemic issue. That is so much systemic, as Steffen and others have talked about. This housing issue is really systemic. Maybe I'm looking at it from the policy perspective, aligning policy and practices on the ground. Maybe because I have tested it myself. So what was the problem was I couldn't have access to any housing. So one person, one Dr. Steve Contopasses, I wish he could hear this, was the one who actually saved my situation, because it got to that time that people were thinking about how are you going to survive? Classes is starting. Should we get you into a hotel? And when I get to hotel with my family, how do we cook? Issues like that. Deborah Lisi Baker was at the forefront looking back and forth here and there. But in the school system, there was no structure put down. So as an advocate, I was talking. I was not quiet. I was asking questions, writing letters to people who I thought are at the helm of affairs, can change things. But everything seems to be in silos. Nobody is working with, everything seems like we are working together, but everybody has no idea. Nobody had any idea about how we can accommodate a person with disability, Black, an international student, because we have stratified the lines to make sure that they don't join us. They are not part of us. Because I got some housing opportunities, but because I'm a Black. I got some opportunities, but because I have a family. I got some opportunities, but because I have I have a disability. So how did I actually solve this problem in UVM system? I started talking to the stakeholders, and that actually led me to the PCIE, the President Commission on Inclusive Excellence. I joined that because I was very vocal and I wanted to change something about that. And what I did was I actually matched up with them in every meeting. We were trying to see how already what systemic policies are going to be changed, which never changed anyway, because we are working with other housing agencies. But the reality is, are they really working alongside with the people on the grassroots practically? For instance, I wrote a letter and I asked if we can have a percentage, for instance, to represent people of color, people who have families, people who are have disability. Those are some of my identities that I have used to advocate for. If, for instance, UVM is working with a Chaplain Housing Trust, can we have a percentage in your building that any of this identity can have? Those things don't exist. The issue for me was not me, because for me, when that day come and Dr. Steven asked me if you can come to our house and see if you can climb the stairs. Interestingly, I have crawled all my days in my life. When I got to those 5 steps in front of their house and I put on my hands on the ground and crawled, he was tormented. He was like, no way, I can't see this, no way. And by the time I entered the house, this man, knowing me from nowhere, just because he had heard my voice and heard everything that I was struggling with, and said, why can't we host you so that you will not be struggling and we will continue searching? So immediately that particular day I entered his house, he actually made a way for me. He immediately called some friends around. They created a ramp for me. And that was how best I came back with my wheelchair and packed my things to their house. From that day, that single day that I visited them, they made a ramp and I was able to stay with them for 1 whole year. Now, coming to how do I leave the house after 1 year? I couldn't get access to any place. Up to now, how did I get to where I am, where my son is thinking after talking or selling ourselves out, we will leave the place is 1. I had to work with another international student from Congo who has been in an apartment which seems to be accessible, because where I am is not very much accessible, but because I can enter. Because when you go to other places in the room, you are not going to have things easy. But we have to plan, because I heard another building it's empty, or another housing is empty, and we had to plan. And he applying to that one, and me applying also to his, to have an exchange program. That was how bad it was, because I couldn't have any single apartment to rent, and that person I had to wait, and we had to be talking. At the point, we had to go to both landlords that this is the strategy we are trying to adopt, and they have to just look at me and see that I have a need. And it was not easy, because where he was going, he had to pay higher than where he was. So it was basically the communal life that we have led in Africa for a long time, that when you see another African suffering, you will say that this is my brother or this is my sister, nothing about we are not from the same family. That has led me to be in this room today, because I had to wait for him to mobilize money to move to the top, where he had to go and empty this room for me for about another 6 months. So you see how I got here, and that is how my son was asking, are you sure? Talking about all these things, we are living here, because this year is marked for what? Blacks, because when other students also heard that it is a bit for those who are not rich, and those who are Black, and those who have some kind of identity, some people started leaving. And as they left, I also tried to leave, but because I can have access, and because they are not very much accessible housing anywhere except. So the question is, will I even move around in Vermont? No. The issue is big no. The issue is, if I really want to move out from this room, then I'm leaving Vermont. That is what I keep telling myself, because for a whole 1 year, we look for accessible housing and we never found. How are we going to really fight for this justice, like housing justice? I think for me, looking at it from a communal life perspective, as I said, everybody is working in silo in this country, or as much as Vermont is concerned. Everybody seems to tackle the issue or to be solving the issue. But when we get to the bone of it, we are not able to crack it. It becomes a hard nut to crack for everybody. So to me, maybe I'm looking at it from the policy perspective. I wish there is a federal law. There is a federal law which will trickle down to the states, that this amount of housing should be made available, affordable, accessible for people of my identity, people of my caliber. And because we know the rich have theirs already, we don't need to see who is paying how much tax or whatever to align with that. So for me, one, policy-wise, which will trickle down to the states level. Secondly, we must try to live a communal life, because there were so many times that I could have helped. I could have been helped by some of my Black friends, but because the law or the policy here says only one person can stay in this room, people who are very much ready to help are not able to do it because they were scared. What about if my landlord gets to know? In our context, for instance, if you have a single room, 2 or 3 people can share that room, because for us, it's about life, it's about family, it's not about me alone. So that alone also tells us that the individualistic system or systemic plans that we have from time immemorial to now is still leading our processes, is still leading our practical life. So ideally, I wish there is a way to also think around communal life, even as we are trying to have things done easily. And finally, if we wish to solve this very well and collectively, I will say that this particular movement should be something that we should all be part of, should be part of practically, not just Zoom meeting, not just talking about it. Because for me, action is my point. At a point, I just need to know after this talk, what next? What is the next plan? Those are the things that everybody on this platform, and I know coming to this platform this evening, it means a lot to everybody. And I wish everybody could take a piece of it and just say, I'm going to do just one. I'm going to do something practical about this and make life easier for other people. Thank you very much.
Thank you, doctor. You are really amazing, and thank you for, you know, pushing us to like move forward and to, yes, concrete action. That's what we have to do. Enough talking. So I'm gonna, we have two more people, and I'm really excited about this because I've been in Vermont for 3.5 years. Well, first, now that I see Deborah, I just have to say that Dr. Sefakor mentioned Deborah Lizzie Baker, and I am a great, you know, I just want to highlight this amazing advocate on disability rights for like decades and decades and decades in Vermont, who led me to, you know, all this work around disability rights, and who's just amazing. So if you do not know Deborah Lizzie Baker, you should know her. You should research her. She's amazing. She does curriculum, and it's just the all advocate. So, like I was saying, I've been here for 3.5 years, and I come from LA and Arizona and New Jersey. And I was like, where is the housing justice movement, the vibrant, you know, Philly movement where they take over houses and go in there? And so seeing like there's a new, and I'm not sure if it's new, it's new to me, the Brattleboro Tenants Unions and Burlington Tenants Unions, who it for me has been more visible in the past year. So I'm gonna now introduce you to Charles, who is from the Burlington Tenants Union, and they're gonna tell us what they're doing.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. So I wanna share my personal story very quickly and then talk about the Burlington Tenants Union. I grew up in a home that my parents rented and eventually bought. During the Great Recession in 2007, my parents lost their home. Around that same time, my father, who had a lot of medical issues, particularly diabetes, he lost his leg. And being a part of seeing that happening and experiencing, I think for the first time in my life, how hard it is for someone who has mobility issues to find housing. And my parents live in Providence, Rhode Island, but you know, they didn't have good credit, so that already kept them from finding rentals that would work. They wanted to stay in their community, which was obviously gentrifying and far wealthier than they could afford. And so they lucked out that a family friend who was a landlord was willing to rent to them below market. But the apartment was not ADA accessible, and so what ended up happening is my parents had to choose between having a roof over their head or not, and they chose the roof. And because of that, you know, my dad would fall multiple times, and it quickened his illness and caused him, I believe, to die prematurely. And so housing is such an important issue. It's filled with so much trauma for so many of us, especially once you start getting that intersection. And Burlington itself is such a unique community for lots of reasons, but one of the things that makes it really tough is that we don't have a strong community in Burlington. We don't have a strong community of long-term residents. In the past 20 years, we've seen gentrification continue to push and price out low-income families, particularly families that have come from generational poverty, families that 30 years ago could afford to live in Burlington and now are really being pushed out to suburbs where not only can they no longer rely on public transit, it's harder to find jobs, it's harder for them to be able to move around. And so for what the tenants union, and I'm just one member of it, but what we really try to do is reinforce the idea that the only power we have is the power that we collectively build as tenants. And it's only the power that we can collectively build against the landlord class and landlords, because at the end of the day, landlords have a different goal than tenants. Tenants, at the end of the day, are second-class citizens. we have no right to our home, regardless of how long we might have been living there. Even in the city of Burlington, we're just trying to pass something as simple as just cause eviction. And when you want to talk about systemic issues, we recently had a city councilor who is a landlord themselves, who worked with the code enforcement director to only send an email out to other landlords about just cause. And so when you look at the systemic issue, it's how the Senate, the Vermont Senate is almost half landlords. And there was a recent article in 7 Days, it might have been a few years ago at this point, where one of the senators said, well, this isn't a conflict of interest, even though I'm voting on whether to help tenants and I am a landlord because I'm part of this class. And that's a very Vermont ideal. I'm from a bigger city, I'm from Providence, and so much of Vermont is this idea, well, we're all friends, we all get along, we all really want what's best for everyone, but we don't always. Our interests do not align. And I think as a tenants union, that's something that we really, really try to get across, is that, yes, we can support you with, find resources for you or connect you to nonprofits, but that's a Band-Aid solution. As long as there are landlords, and in the city of Burlington, 27 landlords own over $1.2 billion worth of property. In the city of Burlington, 1% of all residents control over half, 50 to 60% of all housing, or about $3 billion worth of property. And so how do you change that power imbalance? Because that, at the end of the day, is the issue. We have a mayor who is a developer, who often, and him and his supporters often say, we need all types of housing. It's essentially the housing argument that it's like all lives matter. It's just not true. Even if you look at the data, even if you don't, and you're just someone who intrinsically knows it, there's a lot of housing for people who are wealthier. In particular, when it comes to rentals, in earlier activist or organizer was speaking about area median income. And one of the things that is so true is that area median income, like in Burlington, just as a small example, it doesn't include just Burlington. It includes the whole Chittenden County, it includes Charlotte, it includes Shelburne. Area median income isn't just renters, it's homeowners. And so what ends up happening is even housing that's affordable housing, from whether it's Champlain Housing Trust or some of the other nonprofits, often is not actually affordable to most renters. And so, yes, we really need federal infusion of money, but I think the idea of defunding the police, I think the idea of recognizing that if housing is a human right, then it has to be guaranteed for everyone, in housing that works for them, not just whatever crumbs or slums that they're able to afford. If people want to live 2 or 3 people to bedroom, that's great, but only if they have the option to live in their own bedroom. I mean, that's so much of the issue. And so much of our policy revolves around this public-private partnership, which I think, as we've seen over the past 30 or 40 years, has failed. It has just failed, except for the few people who are lucky enough to get that housing. And in particular with nonprofit housing, it's often more, as the years have gone on, it's folks who are educated, who are upwardly mobile, as opposed to in the past where it was folks who might have been struggling more. And so, yeah, for the tenants union, that really is such the big question is how do we overcome this country which was founded on property rights and gives exclusive special rights to people who own land, and particularly landlords, and how do we break that relationship? Another thing about Burlington that's pretty unique is that we have 2 universities, and those universities not only have students that are far wealthier than the community, the families are wealthier, but the rents are extremely expensive. Just want to finish here that at UVM, a traditional triple is $894 per person. So that's, almost $2,700 for a bedroom. Champlain College is $900 per person for a 4-bedroom. Anyone who's trying to work in this community just can't afford it. And so the Burlington Tenants Union, we have a lot of work to do. We really want to directly organize tenants and build that tenant power. And thank you so much for having me here.
Thank you so much. And I can't believe we are running out of time, but we're still gonna, we can still do it. So what I'm gonna do is have our last panelist, and then we're just gonna have a few minutes for questions, and I'm gonna share a document for you to like think about today and put in this document the 3 questions that Steffen posed for us, which is what would you do? Did you have them written down, Steffen? What would you do?
You want me to read them again?
Yes, that would be great.
I always write them down because my brain goes out the window. So it was 2. Well, no, it was 3. What will you do today? So like direct action, like your small but deliverable goal.
Getting skipped here.
I'm a therapist.
I just wanted to like illustrate the conversation before I went on.
Trevor, you're not muted.
Okay, and then
oh, sorry.
What like POC queer people or in your network will you actively help that are within this movement? Because there are a lot. And you know, what direct solutions will you try your best to create within your own sphere of influence, whether it be policy, legislative, or just direct action, or you know, grassroots.
Thank you. So I'm gonna put it in the document. So Trevor, and so Trevor's here with the Brattleboro Tenants Union.
Yeah, can everyone hear me all right?
Yeah.
Great. Yeah, so I just wanted to thank everyone else for speaking, and particularly Charles and the work that the Burlington Tenants Union has been doing. The Tenants Union in Brattleboro is new this year, so we've been you know, studying what a lot of other tenants unions have been doing, and we've learned a lot from the Burlington one. So I want to echo a lot of what Charles said. So I am a renter in Brattleboro currently, and basically I lost my job due to COVID. I was working in the food service industry and had to find housing right as the pandemic was ramping up. So I noticed that the prices were much higher than I was expecting, and it was quite difficult. I was able to secure housing, but I have been organizing with the Tenants Union of Brattleboro, and we've been running into a lot of similar issues here. We have a select board rather than a mayor, but several of the members there are landlords, and we basically have seen that some of the newspapers and the group of landlords that organizes is in communication with the select board, and it's been pretty difficult to get things passed. Most recently, we've been working on getting a proposal passed that Burlington has had for a long time that would limit a security deposit to 1 month's rent and prevent landlords from charging the last month's rent up front for a move-in. So we really just think lower, you know, keeping the overall market affordable as possible is important, because we also see that the public-private partnership to build affordable housing doesn't really work that well. A lot of people have brought up the area median income as being an issue there, and we know that basically if you're too far down the social hierarchy, you don't have the paperwork, as people were saying, if you don't have an ID or a social security card to get government assistance. And then there's all these people who are just above that who don't get the assistance, and that doesn't work. So we have from the beginning have been trying to uphold housing as a human right, and we definitely think it should be a guarantee. So we've been really looking at what a lot of other cities have been trying across the country. And I think what we are trying to push for is really a housing first model, that housing should be a guarantee, and that Brattleboro, the town, owns lots of property, and that we're renovating a lot of old buildings. And I believe it was Asma who said that the motel programs are great, but they're temporary, and buying a building and turning it into housing and meeting people's needs right now directly is where we need to go. I'll also say that I my father passed away when I was younger, and so I came into some inheritance. As a white person, I have this familial wealth, and that's privilege, even though it's mixed with trauma for me. And I was able to purchase a 3-acre plot of land, and so I've been trying to build housing for myself there, and I'm seeing that Vermont, while the environmental regulations are amazing, there's a lot of like NIMBYism, and there's a lot of like, we don't want to see the housing and we don't want large buildings. And it makes it incredibly expensive to build any kind of housing. Yeah, it's been really difficult. So yeah, thank you for having me on here. And I look forward to hearing more about everyone's efforts. And I'm glad so many people are focusing on this. We definitely need the organizers today.
Thank you, Trevor. Yes, the organizers are good and they're rare, so we need more. So I think it's 10 minutes, so we have like 10 minutes for questions. I put in the doc some of the questions that Steffen posed for us. And remember, this is a 3-day conference, so tomorrow we're gonna have kind of like the legislators who are going to be talking about what is happening. There's a 4-year plan, so please feel free to come and ask questions and like push. And then we have another panel that's talking about fair housing and what are the challenges around that. And then we're going to end with Richard Rothstein, who wrote The Color of Law, which is this amazing book that just talks about the government's role in housing segregation and what we can learn from it. And we're going to end with a community panel led by Susanna Davis, Brian China, and Hal Colston to talk about, reparations, land, and all these intersections. So please make sure that you are then at the end, we're going to have an image of what solutions come from here. So please do fill in some of those things in that document. So do you have any questions or other comments? Sure, Corinne, I can read it for you if you'd like to put it. Corinne, do you want to put the question in the chat? I can read it for you if you like. So the question is, it is my understanding that much of the affordable housing in Burlington is developed as part of zoning laws and therefore dependent on market rate housing. Is that for any of the folks in Burlington?
There you go. If you look at the housing that's most expensive, it is in the wealthier neighborhoods that are lower residential density. If you look at it, where the inclusionary zoning units have been built and where new development has been built, it's been in the downtown and the Old North End, historically working class neighborhoods, and particularly more recently, working class neighborhoods of color. And so zoning plays a part, but when our government revolves, I think particularly around homeowners. Several years ago, I ran for city council, and I remember one homeowner telling me, I pay more property taxes than you do. And I said, how much do you pay? And they said, $6,000 a year. And I said, my rent on my 2-bedroom is $22,000 a year. I'm paying more property taxes. And so I think like this idea that being a homeowner elevates you, or being a landlord elevates you, needs to disappear. I think we need to treat land as a common use, and that's the only way we're ever going to be able to house everyone, because landlord or developers will stop building the moment they can't make a profit.
Thank you, Charles. Any other questions?
Amanda, I think that there was some more to Corinne's question, which was how do we find funding for affordable housing without market rate housing? And then Matilda seems to have a question as well.
Thank you.
I just want to give some perspective, actually, from some other cities about that question. And that's why I mentioned the issue of faith-based ministries that have initiating housing initiatives and the partners that they have through fundraising more directly, and then connecting with lenders who then fund the project and make the guidelines for who then becomes renters or tenants, who then also get to be involved in programs where, as they stabilize their income or do other participate in any other initiatives in the communities, they can sometimes become eligible for certain home ownerships or cooperative buildings. So this may not be a model that has come right here, but it is a model in the housing industry that's been really successful in some other areas. It won't solve all the problems, but it is another model besides just simply depending on market forces. The other thing is universities can shift to be helpful with that, because they don't necessarily fund it, but they can help with sort of the research and also the professionals and who are needed from their professional schools to encourage that, not only for students but for professors to become part of the people who serve on the boards, and also do the financial advising and the education around financing that can be useful to the surrounding community, and also leveraging with city and state local government.
Pamela, can everybody hear me? I'm a little bit worried now about my mic. Great, okay. I just wanted to say, like, your points are really good, and I also feel obligated to just have a little bit of an air of caution, because we have seen, even in Vermont, that some faith-based housing solutions have enacted like conversion therapy approaches for LGBTQ plus people. And obviously, I don't think that's what you're getting at, yeah. But it's just something to be aware of, as like sometimes faith-based organizations market themselves in a certain way, but what happens on the ground is, like, if you come out as LGBTQ plus, or if you are LGBTQ plus and trying to access those services, you're denied. And yeah, it's just something to keep in mind. It's not a reason to not seek those resources. There's a lot of good that can come from them, but certainly something to make sure that we're keeping in mind to make sure that doesn't happen.
Yeah, well, but that goes along with the training in terms of equity and inclusion. And I'm talking about projects who use that to become leaders in the community, specifically from those models. And that is something where, like I said, if they seek collaboration from think tanks or other educational sources where those are clearly identified and training is going on and evaluation.
Thank you. Sorry about that.
But it's a good point.
Yes, that is a great point. And also, just Charles put in, nonprofits often have little transparency or accountability to their tenants or community activists. And that is part of the move, right? That we need to, you know, part of this work is action, and it's also accountability. How do you make the Human Rights Commission accountable? How do you make our government accountable? How do we together, we need to be able to move and shake things up and say, you know, we are in this together, and we do need to like work together to push and be accountable and transparent in all that we do.
Monda, I think someone spoke to that earlier. You know, when we talk about those connections that we don't necessarily mention, but we all know that are there. You know, Vermont is small, and it's very homogenous, and people know each other, and they say weird things that folks of color and probably other people don't understand. Like, I'm a proud Vermonter. It's like, what are you talking? Okay, well, I don't know what that means, but that's great for you. You know, it's very strange. So I think that there is I think that there is a sentiment that needs to be called out, and that is like these like whispering armies of people who are making and brokering certain deals behind closed doors, or fostering connections behind closed doors, and then they get into these boardrooms or get into these places and pretend like they don't know what each other are talking about. And that is something that's very real, and it's a big byproduct of white supremacy. And I think that's something that has to be called out or talked about more, right? There are lots of places that I see folks of color, but there are also lots of places that I don't. I never see people of color at a lot of these economic summits, these business summits, and these places where these decisions about stuff like this are made, and frankly, we're not invited. So there are spaces where we're just not, and it's purposeful.
Thank you. So it's 5 o'clock. I want to ask VCR2 if you want to ask the question. Did you say you had a question?
Sure. Yeah, I can be relatively quick. I guess mine is more in response to what I've seen happen in the pandemic, where we've seen a real big boom in people coming to Vermont and renting places out and buying a lot of places, and seeing a lot of my friends, families, or just in the circles that I've touched, people either losing their housing or afraid that they're going to lose their housing, and not having housing and not being able to find any because it's suddenly being quickly picked up. So my question is this trend being looked at? And is there any tactics or initiatives or long-term strategy happening right now in these organization circles to address what kind of inequities this boom is going to have for traditionally marginalized peoples?
And I think we have a bunch of experts in the room too that are also doing some of this work, but and tomorrow there's going to be that panel also with the economic development folks and some of the state legislators who are the ones that are doing some of the bills, and Earhart, who I see as like kind of a guru on these housing issues as well. But if people here have an answer to that right now, that would be great.
So I have a question too, and thank you very much first for the conference. So I would like to, I think I didn't really understand everything. I would like to know if the real problem is the actual law that empower too much the landlords, or if it's the behaviors of landlords that make housing complicated for tenants. And if it's the law, do you have like an example of I don't know, a kind of law that can be highlighted, because I don't see really well the context, and I don't know if one of the people who talked, I don't know if you understand my question, but I hope I'm clear.
Anybody want to answer too?
I mean, this is not much of an answer, but the question before yours, Madeline, somebody asked about like people moving into Vermont. They have cash, they're buying, you know, places where, you know, when people want to sell, they're looking at loans versus this, you know, where money could just be put down. I wonder if policy can come into, you know, is there something that we can implement to say, you know, I mean, I don't even know, but like priority goes to those who live in Vermont, or because that is reality. That's definitely what's happening now. People are coming from out of state and they have cash and they're just putting money down. And so, yeah. And also something I put in the chat, I don't know if we talked about too much here is, as we're talking about affordable housing, you know, we think of rent a lot, and how do we make people homeowners, right? Because that's how people build wealth and then pass that wealth along to their kids. So what policies can we make, particularly around those who are oftentimes kept out and yeah, from getting loans, etc., particularly the Black community, but also the brown community and queer and trans, etc.
Just responding quickly to Asma, and this doesn't get to Matilda's question, but I would really caution, and I recognize that was just a bit of a, or perhaps it was just a bit of a spitballing thought, but the idea of only those who are already here are prioritized for housing has been a tool that's been used to keep homogenous communities and avoiding integration. So just want to pump the brakes on the idea that prioritization that those who are already here are prioritized for housing has been a really fraught prospect in the past in our country.
Thank you, Sean, for that. So much for everybody that was here today. And for all the wisdom, please make sure to follow all the organizations that were here. The Vermont Center for Independent Living. Skylar is a new consultant. If you need something from him, he's here. I will send out the recording, and I will send out some of the contacts of organizations for you to follow and ask questions. And remember, this is a thread. Make sure you use that Google document that I put in. I will also send you that so that you can tell us what solutions, what can we come out of this conference doing together as Vermont, how we can push each other to actually make housing less unbearable for many, or not a problem that should exist. And if, yeah, thank you, everybody. And bye.
Thank you.